Utilitarianism is a moral philosophical position whose method is often used in political decisions. The focus is on the benefit to society as a whole. The overall well-being of a society should be increased, and the happiness of as many people as possible maximized. It is weighed up which political decision would have the best consequences for the greatest number of people affected. This decision is then morally imperative. One example of such a cost-benefit calculation in politics is the Aviation Security Act, which was passed in Germany in January 2005. Section 14, 3 of the law allows an aircraft to be shot down if it is to be used as a weapon against human life. This permission to shoot down an aircraft also applied if there were innocent persons in it, for example, hijacked passengers. The lives of innocent passengers on board could be sacrificed in favor of the lives of other people on the ground. This is a classic utilitarian cost-benefit analysis. The corresponding paragraph in the Aviation Security Act was politically, legally, and ethically highly controversial, and was declared unconstitutional by the German Federal Constitutional Court in February 2006. However, the Federal Constitutional Court expressly left open the question of whether a German army pilot who shoots down a hijacked aircraft could be held criminally liable. The German lawyer and writer Ferdinand von Schirach addressed this moral problem in his play, Terror. Fighter pilot Lars Koch shot down a passenger plane to prevent a terrorist from crashing the aircraft into a packed soccer stadium. He now has to stand trial. We take the case from Ferdinand von Schirach's play, Terror. A passenger plane carrying 164 people hurtles towards a packed soccer stadium with 70,000 people. Can fighter pilot Lars Koch shoot down the passenger plane? The utilitarian answer is a clear yes, because the balance of pleasure and pain for all those affected by the action is clearly better if the plane is shot down. Since the 164 passengers on the plane will die anyway, shooting them down first causes less suffering overall for all those affected by the act. Let us first look at the strengths of utilitarianism using this example. Utilitarianism considers the benefit and well-being of all those affected by an action. The universalist principle states that all those involved in an action must be equally included in the ethical cost-benefit calculation. Animals are also often taken into account in utilitarian considerations. Lars Koch is not acting selfishly when he shoots down the plane, but considers all the people affected by his decision. No individuals or groups are favored either. Even if his own family were on the plane, he would have to shoot it down. It is therefore an egalitarian ethics that does not favor any particular person or social group. If only rich aristocrats were on the plane and only ordinary workers in the stadium, it would still have to be shot down. This equal treatment of all social groups and classes may seem quite normal to us today. At the time of the emergence of classical utilitarianism, when there was still census suffrage in England, it was not. And even today, in many parts of the world, equal consideration of all people in moral or political decisions is not a matter of course. This strength makes utilitarianism attractive in an enlightened democracy for socio-political decisions that can be accepted by a large majority. In contrast to Kant's ethics, the utilitarian method is also very close to reality. The pursuit of maximum happiness, which is expressed in the hedonistic principle of utilitarianism, is accepted as a goal by almost all people. No reference needs to be made to a moral feeling, a religion, or an ideology in order to prove the morality of an action. In reality, human actions and decisions are usually based on an assessment of the consequences. Before making a decision, people normally consider what the likely consequences are and then act accordingly. Completely ignoring the consequences, as Kant demands, seems unrealistic. Long-term consequences must also be taken into account. The decision of the Federal Constitutional Court in 2006 would therefore be wrong from a utilitarian point of view. Terrorists will always use innocent people as weapons in the future without such permission to shoot them down. The state renders itself helpless by not allowing the shooting down of a passenger plane that has been misused as a weapon. Science and experience can be incorporated and taken into account when weighing up the consequences. Technology assessment is fundamentally based on the utilitarian method of an ethical cost-benefit analysis. It deals with the analysis of scientific and technical innovations and the associated social developments, in particular, the assessment of opportunities and risks. In the example of the hijacked plane, it was also calculated on the basis of empirical values that the stadium could no longer be evacuated in time. Another strength of utilitarianism is that it is possible to calculate which actions are morally right and which are not. This makes decisions transparent and comprehensible. Happiness units can be compared and offset against each other. The pleasure-pain balance in the example is very clear. While 70,164 people would have died if the hijacked plane had not been shot down, only 164 passengers would have died if the plane had been shot down. The lives of a few must be sacrificed for the lives of many. Decisions can thus be made transparent and comprehensible to a broad mass of people. Politicians often explain their decisions with such a cost-benefit calculation and thus gain the understanding and support of their voters. But are moral decisions really always predictable? In reality, there are some calculation difficulties with the utilitarian method. This is because pleasure or pain is very difficult to calculate, especially when it comes to the pleasure or pain of other people. The more people are involved in an action, the more difficult the calculation becomes. We have seen how problematic and complicated such a calculation can become with Bentham's hedonistic calculus. In this example, the high numerical difference makes it very clear how the pleasure-pain balance turns out. In other cases, with a smaller difference in the number of people affected, this is much more difficult. It is difficult to define criteria for calculating pleasure or pain, and even more difficult to quantify, calculate, and compare pleasure and pain. Let's imagine there were only 200 people in the stadium, and Lars Koch didn't have a fighter plane, but was instead piloting a passenger plane with 186 people on board. Would he be allowed to steer one passenger plane into the other? At least then only 350 people would die and not 364. It is also difficult to define who is affected by an action. Let's take our modified example with the two passenger planes again, and imagine that all the passengers on Lars Koch's plane have large families who love and miss them. In the stadium, and on the other plane, on the other hand, there would only be single persons and childless senior citizens. There are also difficulties with the calculation basis, namely the consequences. These are unpredictable and difficult to estimate. Consequences can lead to further consequences, which are then even more unpredictable. In the original example, the passengers might be able to gain access to the cockpit at the last moment and overpower the terrorists. In a modified example, Lars Koch's passenger plane could be carrying a scientist who has discovered a miracle cure for cancer. The psychological consequences of actions or conscience are not taken into account or are difficult to take into account. In this case, even a lifelong guilty conscience on the part of Lars Koch would make no difference to the cost-benefit calculation. However, other cases with fewer parties involved are conceivable in which this aspect could make a big difference. Another weakness of utilitarianism is that it only considers the consequences. The good end justifies the bad means. Neither the motive behind the action nor the action itself is taken into account. If Lars Koch had accidentally shot down the passenger plane during an exercise without knowing what the terrorists were planning to do with it, the act would have been just as good morally. The greatest weakness of utilitarianism, however, is that it permits violations of human dignity. Human dignity is inviolable. This is the highest principle of the German Constitution. Accordingly, people must never be made the object of state action. The people in the passenger plane are not free to decide whether they want to sacrifice themselves, but are instrumentalized by Lars Koch. Human rights violations, in this case the right to life, can be justified by the benefit to the general public. However, according to Kant, for example, life must not be weighed against life, as every life is worth an infinite amount. Discrimination against minorities is also legitimate in utilitarianism, as long as it serves the overall benefit. Individual happiness must be subordinate to the happiness of the majority. Minorities can therefore be suppressed in the interests of the common good. Actions that violate human dignity, and therefore also human rights, are counterintuitive. They contradict people's moral intuition. The violation of human dignity and the prohibition of instrumentalization demanded by Kant was ultimately also the reason why the Aviation Security Act was declared unconstitutional and repealed in 2006. Here is an excerpt from the reasons for the judgment of the German Federal Constitutional Court. The passengers and crew members exposed to such a mission find themselves in a hopeless situation. They can no longer influence their living conditions independently of others. This makes them the object not only of the perpetrators. The state, which in such a situation resorts to the defensive measure of Section 14(3), also treats them as mere objects of its rescue operation to protect others. Such treatment disregards those affected as subjects with dignity and inalienable rights. By using their killing as a means of rescuing others, they are reified and at the same time deprived of their rights. By unilaterally disposing of their lives by the state, the airplane passengers, who are themselves in need of protection as victims, are denied the value that is due to human beings for their own sake. Under Article 1(1) of the Basic Law, Right to Human Dignity, it is absolutely inconceivable to deliberately kill innocent people who are in such a helpless situation on the basis of a legal authorization. Even the assessment that the persons concerned are doomed to die in any case cannot take away the character of the killing of innocent people in the situation described as a violation of their claim to dignity. Human life and human dignity enjoy equal protection under constitutional law, regardless of the duration of the individual's physical existence. The view expressed in some quarters that the persons detained on board have become part of a weapon and must be treated as such is a blatant expression of the fact that the victims of such an operation are no longer perceived as human beings. Only means that are in accordance with the Constitution may be used to fulfill the state's duty to protect. This is not the case here. The play Terror was made into a movie, and at the end of the broadcast, viewers had the opportunity to vote by telephone whether they thought the defendant Lars Koch was guilty or not. 13.1% of television viewers voted guilty, and 86.9% voted not guilty. How would you have voted and why? Feel free to write your opinion on this case in the comments.